What's up? How's everyone doing? Novelli, how are you, man?
I am excellent. How are
Good.
you?
Good. Happy Wednesday. We got to make
Yeah,
this
you too, man.
kind of quick. I got to join up with my advisory kids in about 30 minutes, which is good pressure. I'm sure the kids will appreciate that for the speed at which we'll probably go through today's lesson.
Yep.
So let's get rolling. Welcome again to the Ivy 20th Century Show, hosted by none other than Adam Michelangelo Novelli and Brian Michael Slater. We got similar middle names there, Novelli.
I would say exactly the same.
Yeah, good. So recap, at this point, we're 1926. Hitler is thoroughly developing what we're calling the Führer cult through his use of propaganda, public speaking engagements, the success, if you will, of the beer hall push in Munich and subsequent trial made him a widely known figure in Germany, especially in the Volkic groups on the right, on the far right of the ideological spectrum. His writing of Mein Kampf in 1925 helped lay out the worldview for any German who wanted to learn it. He produced a second volume in 1926, just trying to stay relevant in the second half of the 1920s. And I use that word success with the beer hall push. It was a total failure. But ultimately, the propaganda that emerged as a result of his his trial and the unbridled opportunities to speak at length in front of the German media really made Adolf Hitler a familiar name to many of the Germans, not just on the right, but around the nation.
Can I ask a quick question?
Anytime.
So the other day, outside of school, obviously, we were texting about this idea of propaganda, and I thought you brought up some interesting things because I think I maybe had a little bit of a misconception. So, I was kind of under the influence that propaganda usually had to be malicious or mendacious, in fact. But you kind of were disagreeing with me a little bit, and you convinced me otherwise. You want to talk about that for a second before we move on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do believe that propaganda, in its present day denotation, has a negative denotation to it, meaning that it's the primary meaning of propaganda is I think that we use it to mean like demeaning or belittling of another opponent's product or position or whatever that propaganda is being used for. And that was kind of what you were talking about. However, propaganda is merely a tool, a device used by individuals in order to make their product, whatever it is that they're selling, whether it's an ideology or an actual tangible product, better than all the others. And it can take the form of withholding information. You hear a lot of times, you'll hear about bias in the media being a form of propaganda. Like they don't tell you these things, but they'll only tell you those facts, and thus the media becomes propaganda, if you will. It's really in the eye of the beholder. Anyone who is engaging in propaganda is not going to call it propaganda. They're going to call it facts, the truth. And there is, in many cases, truth to something that we would call propaganda. It's just selective truth, So that's really it. The idea of propaganda, what Hitler was so good at was just selecting the truth, and
Alternative facts.
and not sharing, and like I saw, one of my buddies sent me a picture from a meme that a gentleman named Ben Shapiro had shared on Twitter. And it was this like, which button do you press? The meme of which one do you press? Is it the fact that the U.S. has more COVID-19 cases in the entire world, or is it the U.S. has conducted more tests than any other nation in the world? Well, they make it look binary. Really, when you look at the per capita rate at which the U.S. tests, the U.S. is lagging far behind per capita some of the nations like South Korea, in particular, who have fewer citizens in their society, and given as a result of that fewer tests. But it's that selective data use, and it makes people believe that, well, this is the case. It supports my position, and so that's why something might be propaganda. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was a fantastic example. Nice
Well,
contemporary reference there.
thank you. And again, it would be true, right? Like there was no falsehood in the fact that America has tested more people than any other nation. But right, what wasn't talked about is the fact that that per capita, right? When you start looking at on a per 100,000 people basis, we haven't been able to keep up with some of the other civilized nations. So
Yeah, and I just want to make one more point on this, just because
yep.
you're making me think about it, and it's something I like to talk about in social studies class. When you're a citizen and you want to be an engaged citizen about what's happening in the world, there are so few times where facts are truly binary, black and white. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and what you just kind of pointed out is a really good example of that. In that, to get the full picture, you really need to dig deep and
Yep. So all right. So it was obvious to Hitler that power was not going to be achieved by the sword after his beer hall push and his imprisonment, and so they were going to have to get very organized in their use of propaganda in the late 1920s. And in order to do this, he was going to need to have something known as the Grand Coalition begin to become divided over various issues that the German people were being faced with. And so in order to weaken this grand coalition, and we've talked about it in my class, I don't know how much you've talked about it in yours yet, but the idea of having this proportional representation system in Germany allowed for many different parties to have their say in the Reichstag and the German legislature. But in order for them to do any sort of majority legislation where a majority vote would pass the legislation, they had to form these coalitions. And we're going to talk about this grand coalition in a second. But for Hitler to be able to weaken this grand coalition, he's going to need some luck and really significant propaganda efforts to weaken the perception of these four parties that comprise the coalition. And he would appoint none other than Gregor Strasser to be the propaganda department head from 1926 to 29. Strasser was the socialist leader of the Nationalist Socialist Party. So Hitler was the nationalist leader and Strasser was the socialist leader. So Strasser was really socialist. And he would be the one that would be tapped to lead the propaganda department. He's going to be very successful. Hitler's gift was not in organizational leadership. His gift was not in building systems. His gift was in developing propaganda and using it to make the NSDAP appear superior to all the other Volkic groups on the right. And so by the end of 1928, by May, they had a Reichstag election, and the NSDAP only won 2.6%, and which only got them 12 seats in the Reichstag, which was pretty miserable. It was appearing that the party was dying. The Grand Coalition in May of 1928, however, was very strong. Now let's talk about these four parties that comprise the coalition. There's the SDP, which is known as the Social Democratic Party. This was a socialist, really a moderate, a center socialist party. They're not far left-wing socialist. They're by no means even remotely close to the KPD, the Communist Party, but pretty moderate. There's also what they call the Z Party or the Zentrum Party. This was the Catholic Center Party. This is the party for the religious Catholics in society who were pretty moderate. It was a significant party. There's also the DDP, which is the German Democratic Party, which is a liberal party. It was for many middle-class Germans. And then you had the DVP, the German People's Party, which was a center-right party. It was a conservative party that was closer to the moderate, the middle there. However, after the death of their leader in 1929, would move far right-wing and would become a much closer to the NSDAP political party than it was to the SDP. And so these four moderate parties were able to, in the center of the ideological spectrum, if you think of the spectrum as being, here, I'm constrained by the width of my computer screen here. You have, the Volkic parties on both sides, the right wing and the left wing, who can't have any say in the Reichstag because of this cohort of four parties in the middle that have sort of protected the moderate. In America, we call that center the American ideological consensus. It's estimated that 70% of Americans are in that center moderate. They might lean left or lean right, but 7 out of 10 Americans are pretty moderate people. And that moderation is able to suffocate or drown out, if you will, the parties on the left and right wings. And that's what this Grand Coalition was able to do. You got questions at all on this, Novelli?
Well, I guess were they generally considered like a voting bloc? Were they pretty close? And
Correct.
so okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so that's where politics would play a role. You might have the SDP say, hey, we really want this socialist agenda, parts of the socialist agenda to be adopted into law. And then you'd have the DVP say, all right, well, fine, we'll trade you our votes for that in exchange for your votes for what we want in some of these conservative policies. So, they were able to politic their way through legislative agendas. And then in May of 1928, so here's the evidence here to support the fact that the Grand Coalition was pretty strong as of May of 1928. You can see here the parties with the asterisks next to them are members of the coalition. You can see that the SPD by far was the dominant party in this Grand Coalition. Therefore, they're going to have the greater say in the policy agendas. But if you just add these up, right, you got about 30% of the Socialist Party, 30% of the Reichstag controlled by the SPD. You have 12%, so they're up right there to 42%, right? And then you add the DVP, and that takes them over 50%. And in the DVP, they're sitting right around 55% of the Reichstag. So that's how this coalition was able to really dominate the legislative agenda of the Reichstag. Everything was good, right? May 1928, coalition's running strong. And then the winter of 1928, 1929, things get ugly. Economically speaking, there was all sorts of issues in the agricultural sector. There was the farmers were becoming very disenchanted with the lifting of tariffs at this time. So tariffs were lifted on foreign imports, which meant that foreign companies could undermine the prices that German farmers were selling their goods at in the markets. And this angered German farmers. This made it to where they couldn't really pay off some of their debt, which led to bankruptcies, some forced sales of land. Basically, farmers were becoming incredibly irritated with the Weimar Republic in this wintertime of 1920, 1929. They lose their patience. And Hitler, sensing this resentment, decides he's going to pounce on the opportunity to sow division between these farmers and the political parties that had traditionally represented the farmers, which was, by the way, all four of those parties in the Grand Coalition had the agricultural sector that they represented. And so in the first half of 1929, Hitler's going to deliver 16 major public speeches that are going to be filled with just raucous crowds. And these speeches they emphasized these bankruptcies that farmers were having to deal with. He's emphasizing the bankruptcy of the Weimar system as a whole. He's exploiting international finance issues. This time, we're getting close to the stock market crash of October 1929. Some of the alarm bells are starting to go off around the world. He identifies the suffering of the quote unquote small people, right? The little man in Germany, in particular, the farmer. He's blaming all of this on democratic rule, on the issues with allowing this SPD, the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, to govern Germany into financial disaster. He emphasized social divisions that party politics is causing. We should not have a multi-party system. But most importantly, what he stressed was the need to restore German strength and unity. And this resonated with all of those disenchanted Germans who had been bitter for the last 10 years about the loss of the First World War. And so his speeches were resonant. They made the people in especially in Bavaria were all ready. They were ready for him. And so forgive Alexa there, letting the kids know what time it is. It's 12:30, time for them to do some screen learning. So There you go. Shout out to Alexa. Stop listening. First half of 1929, to continue on, his recipe for success in Germany was unchanged. We basically wanted to hammer home the same message over and over again, exploit any opportunity he could for agitation, and then he just bide his time and hope for some external issue to arise that would allow him an opportunity to exploit and create propaganda against it. They were gaining, electoral gains in the state elections, but no realist could have reckoned much to its chances of winning power. For that, Hitler's only hope, and I love this line, and I think if I were you at home, this is a line I would capture in my notes. Hitler's only hope was a massive and comprehensive crisis of the state. And then comes the stock market crash of October 1929 in the United States of America. The Grand Coalition is going to fail miserably in their management of this crisis. And it's crazy. The Volkischer Beobachter, the official newspaper, the NSDAP, didn't even report on the stock market crash. They did not see that this crash was going to have incredible implications on the global economic situation, and in particular in the German economic situation. But it would not take long for the ripples of that catastrophic failure of the American stock market to hit the common German person. And as soon as the NSDAP realizes the magnitude of this crisis, they are going to begin to employ a significant effort to build propaganda and try to turn the German people against the Grand Coalition as quickly as possible. You got questions at all, Novelli?
No, this makes total sense.
Good. Okay. So this agricultural crisis that I had already talked about, that was happening in that winter, 1928, 1929, at this point is going to become rapidly intensified. There were 3.2 million people unemployed by January 1930. This was 14% of the working age population. However, they at the time, they were not an organized enough government to have the real numbers, and it's estimated today that number was actually 4.5 million people of the working age population were unemployed. And so you can imagine that the protests that unemployed individuals, they got all the time in the world in their hands, they don't have a job, so they're going to begin protesting pretty loudly against the Weimar system. And the protests were very consolidated. They really centered on one mission, that the system should be swept away. And by the way, this protest was happening from people on the far right and the far left of the spectrum. And I think I'm mirrored, so I don't know if I just said right and left in the correct order, but it didn't matter if you were a radical communist or in one of those Volkisch groups on the right, a radical Nazi. You agreed that the system needs to be swept away. Where you disagreed is on what system should replace it. But even here, and this is Kershaw, I love this point he makes, even at this point right here, Hitler still doesn't stand a chance. Kershaw says, without the self-destructiveness of the democratic state, the self-destruction of the coalition, Hitler, whatever his talents were as an agitator, could not have come close to power because he had no coalitions. He had no ability to form a coalition. And the coalition was certainly still strong enough. And so you'll see here, I've changed the title up here to the self-destruction of the Grand Coalition because it's going to happen, right? Like Hitler didn't stand a chance. It would take a self-destruction for him to be able to get to power. So I'm gonna go ahead and move this here to go be sideways there again. The self-destruction of the Grand Coalition. I can't make these video things smaller, so maybe I'll do that. And all right, there we go. Okay. The Grand Coalition was under the leadership at this time of Chancellor Hermann Mueller. And with these crises that were taking place, Hermann Mueller had requested to President Hindenburg to use Article 48 powers, which are presidential powers. We talked about the weakness of the political system already in earlier lectures, but the Article 48 rule by decree allowed the president to simply rule as an authoritarian. And Mueller was asking for Hindenburg to bestow upon him some of these Article 48 powers so that he could legislate without needing the Reichstag. And Hindenburg said, no, I'm not going to let you do that. I don't like your policies. The SPD's policies were becoming increasingly liberal, and Hindenburg didn't like the policy proposals for solving this crisis that Mueller had proposed. And so he resigns. Mueller resigns the seat of chancellor at this time. And it was an immediate appointment that followed of the leader of the Zentrum Party, a guy named Brüning. And then President Hindenburg said, all right, look, you can have Article 48 powers. I like your policy ideas. I didn't like the policy ideas of Mueller. So you get the decree powers, and Brüning immediately issues 4 decrees to save Germany. Here they are. In order to save Germany from the economic catastrophe that we are seeing right now, we're going to reduce welfare spending. We're going to order wage cuts. We're going to increase taxes on your income, and I'm going to increase tariffs on imports. Win, win, win. And you can't hear me? Tell me when you can hear me.
I can hear you now.
Okay. These 4 decrees right here. I mean, I just put the rhetorical question down here. To what extent would any human being, let alone an already enraged German citizen, be happy with the decrees that were happening here, right?
Yeah, it's outrageous.
It's outrageous.
I don't know in what world he thought that would be a smart thing to do. Imagine now, I mean, we're kind of going through a crisis right now in our country. Imagine if the federal government came out and said, by the way, taxes, we're raising your taxes. We're going to cut the amount of money that we're giving to people who can't work right now. We're going to increase tariffs, so it's harder to trade. And this is going to help everybody. Thank you. Have a good night. See you later.
Yep. So you can imagine what the Reichstag did. They said, this is stupid. And so they vote immediately to repeal the decisions of Brüning. And so what does Brüning do, right? Because they voted to repeal those 4 decrees. They're like, no, the German people are not going to be okay with this. And that's kind of the point of a Reichstag, right? It's to represent the people. It's the point of any legislative body that's in a republic, is to represent the pockets of people from the communities that elected them. And so what Brüning asked Hindenburg to do is, look, I can't govern with the Reichstag undermining me. Dissolve the Reichstag and call for new elections. And so Hindenburg does it. He dissolves the Reichstag. He says, everyone go home. Your seats are gone. We're going to have another election. And these elections are scheduled for September 14th, 1930. So July, just like kind of do the math, right? July 18th, 1930, Reichstag's dissolved. They're going to go July 18th, August 18th, all the way to almost to September 18th. So, 2 months without a legislative body. And this is going to allow Brüning to govern without having to deal with the Reichstag. But the German people are paying very close attention. And the election of September 1930 was a staggering defeat for the Grand Coalition. You see the SPD lost 5.3% of the majority. The Z lost 0.3%. The DNVP lost 7.3%. But look at the NSDAP.
Yeah, and they weren't even on the last chart.
No,
2.6%
2.6% or something they won.
Yeah.
Look at that. That's crazy, huh?
That's a massive shift in not that long of a time. For politics, that's crazy.
15.7% gain. They become the second largest party in the Reichstag as of September 1930. It's staggering. Kershaw says the decision to dissolve the Reichstag and call for new elections was one of breathtaking irresponsibility. There had been several state and local elections that had occurred thus far, and the NSDAP had achieved pretty significant success in those elections. Like there was an election in one of the local state elections, and the NSDAP won the majority of the votes in that state. and Hitler was able to achieve. He appointed this guy named Frick to the position of Department of Interior. And he said the only two departments that the NSDAP cared about, he said, y'all can control anything else. We want the Department of the Interior and the Department of Education. And they were awarded those positions in those local state elections. And so when you control the Department of the Interior in Germany, you get to control all the law enforcement. Right? You were the leader of the law enforcement in that state. And so, immediately what they were going to start doing is arresting people, right? Any opposition, arrest them. Right? And then, education, let's arrest all the teachers that are socialists. And that's what they did in those state elections. So the point is the NSDAP had been winning some of these state elections. The writing was on the wall, but nobody was reading the writing.
That's
right?
moronic. It's so moronic. I cannot believe that they did that.
You'll see here this line right here. Brüning had greatly underestimated the extent of anger and frustration in the country. The Nazis could hardly believe their luck and prepared for a summer of unprecedented agitation. Right?
Man.
And so the Grand Coalition was all but dead at this point. And the division and terrible decision-making in the Grand Coalition brought them to their own demise. The NSDAP from September 1930 forward is going to continue to grow in popularity. And there you go. That's your self-destruction of the Grand Coalition. Now, this is going to allow Hitler to begin exploiting the Reichstag. The weakness now of the Reichstag is going to be something that's open to exploitation. And there's going to be significant persuasion, coercion that happens from here forward, as well as use of force. But that use of force is going to come at the hands of the SA with no explicit orders from Adolf Hitler. It was a wink and a nod, and business was handled. So there you go, man. You got any other points you want to make or questions you want to ask before they head to their Google Classroom to complete the Google form?
No, I think that was a pretty logical flow of ideas, and even though their actions were pretty illogical, it's super fascinating. It's always interesting that we have these incredible outcomes in the discipline of history, and when you really dive into it, a lot of times it has to do with poor decision making, in addition to just sheer luck.
Yep. Correct. So, but there you go, man. It's 12:43. I said I wanted to end at 12:45. Look at us, sticking the landing. So
yeah, that's good.
All right, buddy. Well, I'll get this uploaded to Google or YouTube, and then we can get it shared out this evening. Okay, man.
All right, I'll see you.
Yep, I'll talk to you later.